In this episode, we'll be using Framer Motion and AnimateSharedLayout to create the smooth transition you see on the screen. You should have a decent knowledge of Framer Motion and React. If you don't, then feel free to watch my other Framer Motion videos where we tackle on more basic animations. I'll also include a written tutorial in the description, so follow that if you need to copy and paste any sort of code. So to get things going, what I'm going to do first is clone our repo. We can type git clone with the repo URL, and we can also specify a folder or directory name. I'll call it code. Once we've successfully cloned our repo, I'll go ahead and clear the terminal, and then we'll want to cd into our folder. Once we're inside our code directory, we'll then switch to the starter branch. I'll type git checkout starter. Once that's complete, we'll need to install all of our packages, so we can write npm install or npm I. I'll also add a double ampersand, which will execute an additional command. Our next command will be code dot, which will open up our project in VS Code. Once that's all good and taken care of, we are now inside our VS Code. I'll open up the integrated terminal and then run npm run start so that we can get the project going. Once the development server has started, we can switch over to localhost 3000 and get an idea of what we're working with. There isn't any crazy animations, and this is exactly where we want to be for the next part of this video. Okay, so let's just do a quick breakdown before we jump into the code. I'll go ahead and open up the source directory, and from there we'll jump into the components folder. Now we've got 4 files. The first one is a banner.js component, which is just the home page or the top banner section. We also have a header.js, which houses the top nav or that header section. In our image.js file, we have an image component, which allows us to use WebP formatted images and also have a JPEG fallback for browsers that don't support WebP. And then finally, our loader.js, which is just the loader component before our page has loaded. Next, inside our Sass folder, we've got 3 folders in here: an abstracts, a base, and a components folder. In our abstracts, we've got a variable file, which just houses the different variables we use for our breakpoints and colors. And then our base has a global, reset, and typography. We don't really need to worry about these. They're just kind of global styles related to our app. And then on our components, we have the exact same styles or separate styles for each component: the banner, the header, and the loader. And then last but not least, we do have a main Sass file, which just imports all those files into one. The reason they're underscores is because those are partials, meaning that they're being imported and being used in one place, being this main Sass. Finally, let's talk about our images. Inside the public folder, specifically inside the image directory, we've got 5 images in JPEG format and 5 images in WebP formats. If we compare the two, there is really no loss in quality, and the only difference is that the WebP formatted files are pretty much half the size of the JPEGs. If you're using VS Code, you could see the different sizes in the bottom right, and it really is a huge change in terms of performance. Last but not least is our app.js, which houses our entire application. Nothing really too complex going on here, and all of that ends the breakdown of our application. Next, let's go ahead and jump into some code. Before we get into the more complex items, let's first install Framer Motion and talk about some basics. I'll open up the terminal and run npm install Framer Motion. This will install the package for us. And before we write any code, I do want to say, if you have additional questions or concerns related to Framer Motion, the Framer team has really outdone themselves here. The documentation is second to none. They really describe the API really well and provide a bunch of examples to follow. Again, link is in the description, and also if you have any questions, you can just comment below. Back in our project, we can go ahead and close the terminal, and the first component we'll animate is inside of our loader.js file. If we open up the components folder, specifically inside loader.js, I'll import motion from Framer Motion. And before we animate, let's just describe what's going on here. Inside our loader component, we have a useEffect hook, which just updates the set loading state to false after 4 seconds. We're also reusing this image block component several times, which, if I scroll down, was just a div that wraps our image component that we referred to earlier in this project. If I wanted to animate this image component, I'll need to turn the parent div into a motion component. We can do so by adding motion dot in front of the div, a sort of prefix to indicate that this parent div is turning into a motion component. With that, we can pass in an animate prop with 2 curly brackets. We will change the scale to 0.5, passing in a transition. Again, with transitions, you need to add a curly bracket with a duration of 1. This will animate our image to a scale of 0.5 with a duration of 1 second. If we go ahead and preview now, you can see that once we refresh the page, the 4 images which all use the image block component all shrink to a scale of 0.5 or half its size with a duration of 1 second. So that's really the very basics when it comes to animating with Framer Motion. There's a lot more complexity that can be passed in, and that's what we'll be doing next. Now back in our code, let's delete the animate prop, and we could leave this component as a motion component for now. Let's go ahead and scroll to the top, and let's talk about variants. Variants can be used to animate entire subtrees of components with a single animate prop. Options like when and staggered children can be used to declaratively orchestrate these animations. So underneath the variant comment, I'll create a variable called container, and this variable container will be an object which contains a show prop. Inside the show, we're going to pass a transition, which will ultimately have a staggered children set to 0.35. This means we're going to stagger the animation of our children by 0.35 seconds. I'll then create another variable and we'll call it item. Inside item, we'll define the animation that's going to be staggered. I'll add a hidden object, and inside of that, we'll set opacity to 0 and Y to 200. This hidden property will be representative of our initial. Before we continue, I'm going to take a quick break to better explain this sort of animation style that Framer provides. So in Framer Motion, we've got 3 states that we animate. We animate the initial, we animate the animate, and the exit. Initial represents the first state of our component, which is before it's mounted. So how it looks like before we even see it. The animate state represents when our component just mounted or has mounted on the DOM tree. And then finally, our exit state represents when we unmount the component from the DOM tree, meaning when it exits out of our view. So essentially, these 3 states are what allow us to control our entire animation from the beginning to end. Our show object will then represent our animate property. We'll set the opacity to 1 and the Y to 0. When setting the Y to 0, it will just bring the position of our element to its original place. Then we'll add a transition, and inside the transition we have a custom ease, which is set to 0.6, 0.01, -0.05, and 0.95. The duration will be set to 1.6. And now let's define our exit transition. So when the component unmounts, we're going to run this animation. We'll set the opacity back to 0. Our Y will be set to -200 so that it could go up the Y axis. And then we'll define the transition, set the ease to ease in out with a duration of 0.8. Now I'll scroll down, and for our loader inner class, let's turn this into a motion component by adding the motion prefix in front of the dev. And then for its variants, let's pass in a container. Now I did make a mistake here. I added variant without the S, so make sure you add the S, and I'll correct that in a few seconds. For the initial, we'll pass in hidden, animate will pass in show, and exit will pass in exit. Now this may be a bit confusing for some users. Why do we have hidden, show, initial, animate, and then exit's the same? So where it says show and hidden, that's coming strictly from our variable, and that's what we named it. You can name hidden and show and exit anything you want from the string side or what we're assigning it to. We can name it pizza for initial, burger for animate, and watermelon for exit. It frankly doesn't matter. These strings that we're passing in are what just best describes our animation. So what we're saying here is when our images are hidden, that will be our initial state. And then when the images show up, that'll be our animate. And then when they exit, it'll be exit. You can even name it initial, animate, and exit if you want. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever suits you best. We're going to use the image block component. And for each image block component, we're going to pass in an item variance. Now we'll use destructuring to bring in variants from the image block. And then for this motion div that we assigned in the beginning, let's go ahead and pass in a variance of variance. Now if we preview, you can see that all of our image block components fade up and in, and that's exactly what we're looking for. but the staggering doesn't really work, or that sort of delay effect. They're all animating at once, and that's not what we really want. This issue is being caused by that previous mistake I had mentioned before, where I accidentally said variant is equal to container rather than variance. So I'll go back into the code real quick and just add an S to our variance. And now if we preview again, you can see that there is that 0.35 second delay between each animating component, aka that stagger children is working exactly how we want it to work. Now once the loader is complete, our images just disappear suddenly. The exit state or that exit animation we defined does nothing. And to fix that, we need to introduce something called AnimatePresence. AnimatePresence allows components to animate out when they're removed from the React tree. It is required to enable AnimatePresence for exit animations to occur. Back in our project, let's switch over to app.js and get AnimatePresence imported. We'll import motion and AnimatePresence from FramerMotion. And then what we need to do next is wrap our entire application with AnimatePresence. So currently in our return statement, we do have a React fragment, but let's just replace that with an AnimatePresence and we'll be good to go there. Now for the loader component, we need to wrap it with a motion component for the exit animation to work. So I'll go ahead and add a motion component and wrap it around the loader component. And then the motion component does need a key to make it a unique identifier for FramerMotion to identify what needs to be animated out. We'll set a key of loader. And if we preview, once our loader is complete, the images fade out. Back in our project, if we switch over to loader.js and go to the loader component, we've got this use effect which sets a timeout to set the state of our loader after 4,000 milliseconds. We want to get rid of that and we want to add an onAnimationComplete. This is from FramerMotion and it only works on motion components. So in onAnimationComplete, we'll run a callback once the animation has completed. In this case, we'll set the state to false. If we preview, nothing really has changed, except that once the animation completes, it then hides the loader. In our project again, let's stay in loader.js and scroll to the top. And now we want to create a new variant called itemMain. Now our hidden is going to be set to an opacity of 0. Our Y is going to be 200. Our show is going to be set to an opacity of 1. The Y is going to be set to 0. And then for our transition, let's go ahead and use the ease with the same cubic Bezier values that we've been adding from before, and then a duration of 1.6. This is pretty much an exact replica of our item variant, except it doesn't have an exit property. Now we need to set this item main variant to this transition image class. We'll turn it to a motion component, and then we'll set variants to item main. This animation is for that main image that's in the center of our loader. Now let's switch back to app.js and we need to import something called AnimateSharedLayout. What AnimateSharedLayout allows us to do is to animate layout changes across and between multiple components. Keep in mind, the components that are being animated must have the same layout ID. So in our project, we need to wrap the entire application with AnimateSharedLayout. This will be a parent to the AnimatePresence. We also want to add a type of crossfade, which allows us to smoothen the animations. Now for our main image that's on our home page, we need to turn that into a motion component and set a unique layout ID. I'll call this layout ID main-image-1. And now we need to make sure that in our loader.js, the similar image that we have, we need to have the exact same layout ID, which is main-image-1. And now if we preview, you can see that the main centered image in our loader will transition smoothly to the home page. Now the transition is a bit off because the duration is way too quick, so let's fix that. Back in our project in app.js, we'll add a transition with the same cubic Bezier we've been using across the app and a duration of 1.6. Now if we preview, the animation is much more smoother and it has a very nice easing to it. Okay, so up next, let's work on the banner animations. We'll switch over to banner.js and let's create some room. I'll want to import motion from FramerMotion, and then we need to define some variants. I'll create a banner variable, and inside the banner variable, we'll set an animate to have a transition with delay children of 0.4. Now before I had mentioned the whole alias thing of using like initial to hidden and animate to show. So in this case, we'll keep it strictly to initial and animate. Now we need to add staggered children, which is 0.1 to our transition. And then we'll need to create a new variable for another variant called letter animation. We'll set the initial to a y of 400 and then an animate, which is going to be y to 0. A transition with the same cubic bezier we've been using before, and a duration of 1. If we scroll down now, inside our banner component, let's turn the parent into a motion component. We'll pass in variants and assign it to banner. If we scroll down a little bit more, we've got the animated letters component. We'll turn the span, which is the parent of the class name of row title, to a motion component, passing in the variant of banner. I'll then set initial to initial, animate to animate. I'll want to turn the row letter class name into a motion component, so let's add motion to the span, and then I'll pass in a variant of letter animation. If we preview now, you can see that all the letters on the banner float up one at a time, and it all has that staggered delay of 0.1. Now let's animate the message in the top right. I'll scroll down to our banner row top component, and inside this we have a row message component, which if we select the row col class name and turn it to a motion component, we'll set the initial opacity to 0 and a y of 80. We'll then set the animate to an opacity of 1 and a y of 0. So a very simple animated motion component here. We'll also want to edit the transition. So for our transition, we'll set an ease of ease in out with a duration of 1 second and a delay of 0.4 seconds. If we preview now, you can see that once the loader is gone, the message kind of floats up and it looks lovely. We'll then animate the scroll down component on that left section. In our project, if we scroll down a bit more, we have the banner row bottom. We'll turn the scroll class name to a motion component, and we'll give it an initial of scale set to 0. Our animate will have a scale set to 1. The transition for this is going to have an ease with the infamous cubic bezier. We should probably set it as a variable since we use it so much. But we'll add a duration of 1 with a delay of 1 as well. Now for our scroll down spans, we need to turn both of those into motion components, and they're going to be very, very similar. So for the initial, we'll set the opacity to 0. Our animate will have an opacity of 1. For its transition, we'll give it an ease of ease in out and a duration of 1, followed by a delay of 1.8. Now instead of writing this again, we'll just copy the entire thing and add it to our down span. Now if we preview and pay close attention to the scroll down component, you can see it scales up and then the text fades in. Sweet. So back in our project now, what we can focus on is stopping the additional messaging in our middle row from animating. We only want the first message to animate. So I'll pass in a disabled prop to the first, the third, and the fourth. And then in our animated letters, we'll bring in the disabled prop through destructuring, and then I'll set a ternary operator. If it is disabled, then our variants will be set to none. Otherwise, we'll set the letter animation variant. If we preview now, you can see that that first item that we see with experience has that letter animation, and then everything to the right and past it doesn't have that animation. So it saves us on some performance because we're animating less items. Now this marquee is animating way too quickly. So I want the animation or the loading animation to finish and then have a bit of a delay, like a 2-second delay before the marquee starts playing. So currently we set the play marquee state once our banner component has mounted, but instead let's add a timeout of 2000 milliseconds, which is a 2-second delay. And now if we preview, You can see that after 2 seconds, the marquee starts playing. Now let's switch over to our header.js and animate the header. We'll first need to import motion from Framer Motion. I'll turn the header class name to a motion component, set an initial of opacity 0, a Y of -180, and for its animate, let's go ahead and set the opacity to 1 and its Y to 0. For its transition, let's go ahead and add an ease in out and a duration of 1. For its delay, let's go ahead and give it a 0.6 delay. And now if we preview, our header flows in from top to bottom perfectly. Let's go ahead and refresh the animation, and everything animates exactly like we want it to. That's going to do it for this video. We sure did learn a lot today. We learned about Framer Motion animations, we learned about Animate Presence, and AnimateSharedLayout. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to leave a like. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. That's going to do it for me. Take care of yourselves out there.